This evening we begin a new series of discussions, and our general subject is the orientation of Hermetic philosophy. In all of these courses, we are attempting in every way possible to present the material without depriving the student of the right to arrive at certain conclusions of his own. In other words, where certain reasonable doubts exist, where conflict or contradiction is present, we will say so, in order that we shall at least have solid ground as far as we can go. And in the case of the Hermetic philosophy, we cannot go as far as we wish that we could. In the first place, the entire origin of this field of thought is utterly obscure. All that we have is a group of definitely conflicting reports. But out of the conflict itself, and out of the very circumstances which surround the times and conditions associated with the beginning of the school, we gain some very useful and practical insight. So we will try to sketch the field first historically. It is generally assumed that the only material that we have relating to the general subject of Hermetic philosophy originates in the writings of the ante-Nicene father, Clement of Alexandria. Clement Alexandrinus includes in his work a considerable discussion of a system of Egyptian ritualistic, symbolical, magical metaphysics, which was prevalent at his time. And he wrote with the perspective of the late 1st and early 2nd century A.D. Clement does not, however, actually approach the central problem, namely, who was Hermes? Thus we have to seek in other directions, not nearly as factual or as comprehensive. The standard texts of the present time do not have any general knowledge of how what is called the corpus hermeticum came into existence. The corpus is composed or made up of a series of writings attributed to a mysterious person called Hermes, and often referred to either as Hermes Trismegistus or Mercurius Termaximus in the Latin form. Several efforts have been made to assume that this Hermes was the Egyptian deity Thoth, Thoth, long associated with the concept of wisdom, and considered by many to have become intermixed with the Greek Hermes, particularly during the period of the Grecian pharaohs of Egypt. That is, the dynasty of the Ptolemies, the dynasty immediately preceding the beginning of the Christian era. There is no evidence of certainty, however, that the Hermes of the Hermetic school was actually the Egyptian Thoth. This, however, brings a further matter. Thoth, as a deity, was worshipped in Egypt for a very long time. It would be safe to say at least for 3,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. The question naturally arises, then, was this deity a deified human being? Did a being or creature by the name of Thoth actually exist at some remote age. The tendency now has been to suggest or suspect that many so-called deities were originally persons, and that through long periods of veneration and infallibility, a kind of deification was given to them by popular esteem. Plato declares that there were at least 5 persons by the name of Hermes in the Greek system. Therefore, that somewhere along the descent of this name, it was bestowed upon persons. Now, 2 possibilities present themselves under this thinking. The first is that the original concept of Thoth as one of the 5 elder deities of Egypt was that he was a god, and like Osiris, was originally a divine being, the basis of a general worship, at least in certain provinces and areas of Egypt. That later, this name was bestowed upon certain human beings as a title of honor or distinction. They were given names to indicate that they were Thoth-like or Hermes-like. Also, there is something to recommend the idea that early writers, recognizing Hermes as the deity of universal mind, took the position that mind is the author of all works. Therefore, that behind the human author of every product is the universal mind, who might well, therefore, be regarded as the genuine compiler, writer, or editor of the work. Thus, a work could be dedicated to the universal mind as its true author. Thus, persons in many ages could attribute their own productions, particularly those of vision and inspiration, to a deity long honored and regarded. It might then well occur that, as in other religions and in other systems, Thoth-inspired teachers were said to have arisen, becoming the embodiments or incarnations of the principle of wisdom, therefore entitled to bear this name. Certainly there were several persons by the name of Orpheus, as Taylor points out for us in his analysis of the mystical hymns of Orpheus. There was certainly more than one person in the course of time known as Zoroaster or Zarathustra. And it is quite possible that the last of the Zoroasters, who is said to have been personally known by Pythagoras, was by no means the first of these fire prophets, but was a distinguished philosopher or mystic or illuminata who had received this name as an honorary title. Thus it is quite conceivable that the name of Thoth or Hermes, because of the peculiar sphere of influence over which this deity was said to rule, could well have been associated with human beings, whereas many other deities might not so readily adapt themselves to this process of humanization, or this process of perpetual or periodic re-embodiment. We then have another thought, which is rather daring, has not perhaps received too much consideration, but might be worth a second glance. Namely, that Hermes, or Thoth Hermes, the final person with whom we are concerned, was actually a ritualistic personification. In other words, that this so-called person was the symbolic impersonation of an idea, and that with the gradual passing of time, this person became real, although no one seemed to know where he came from, who he was, or how he departed from this life. if he was a person in a sacred drama, a character in ritualism, a hero signifying universal mind, or even human mind, in its noblest and broadest sense. This person could become identified with a story. Ritualism could create a life for him, create situations, but these situations would be essentially symbolical rather than literal, although they might be very well set forth in a rather literal appearing relationship. That such may have been the case in the situation involving Hermes is not unreasonable, for we know that even Clement refers to the Hermetic system as broadly and deeply ritualistic. Wherever ritualism becomes important, we have this tendency for the emergence of a prominent or principal ritual personality who becomes the actual embodiment of the doctrine, the procedure, and all that has to do with a system of religious philosophy or mysticism. We know also that it is quite possible for imaginary or ritualistic persons to gradually gain historical definition. A good example, of course, is the story of the Count of Monte Cristo, who had no existence except in the fertile imagination of Alexander Dumas the father. Yet even today, tourists are taken out to the prison where he was imprisoned, and his cell is carefully and faithfully shown to them. The fact that he never existed is of no particular importance anymore. Now, there have been a number of instances in which imaginary persons have so taken the public fancy that we prefer to accept them as factual. Now, this is on a secular level. If we add to this the aura of divinity, creating a mystery and framing within this mystery a transcendent being, there is every reason to assume that it might be perpetuated as an historical person. So we have, in summary, about three broad possibilities here. One, that we are dealing with a divinity representing a universal state of consciousness, and that this divinity simply descended into the Greek period of Egyptian philosophy and was regarded as the patron of a school or system. The second is that this divinity was represented by embodiments, and that therefore priestly initiates, teachers, authors, and scribes may have received this name and have therefore been regarded as this person. And the third, that he is a ritual figure, as we will find in many other religions and philosophical systems. With this situation, as broadly expressed as we can, we then come to the intricate problem of dating the Hermetic philosophy. Nearly always we must date a subject, particularly an unknown work, by context, by a study of the structure, by a study of the internal ideas presented. It is nice to assume that ideas can be born out of time, or that they can appear full-born and full-grown like Minerva from the head of Zeus. But actually this is very rarely, if ever, the case. Every idea of man is set into a framework of time and place. The average person, and even the average highly informed person, cannot be totally unhistorical. He cannot have attitudes that are totally unknown to the world in which he lives. Nor can he develop an idiom or a form of expressing himself that is completely outside of the language structure of his own time. Thus, through idiom, through structure, and through various colloquialisms, forms in grammar, and other instruments, it is nearly always possible to historically establish a work within a very few years. An example of this, of course, a good example, is the early Rosicrucian manifestos. The Famuf and Confessio Fraternitatis and the Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosenkreutz, these books are supposed to have been written much earlier than their date of publication. Actually, however, by studying them, we discover that no matter when they were written or how they were written, they could not have been written before the rise of Martin Luther, because there are certain ideas incorporated into them in certain patterns which did not exist or were not known before that date. Thus, the earlier dating must be regarded as largely mythological. Now, in the study of the Hermetic writings, as they are preserved for us, we are in the presence of certain elements or factors that cannot be denied. The first is that they do not represent the philosophy of the ancient Egyptian. They are not a bona fide perpetuation of the ancient Ammonistic doctrine of the principal Egyptian systems. They are not grounded or set in the Osirian cycle or the great restoration of Egyptian religion, nor can we clearly find them oriented into the temporary reforms of Akhenaten. That these teachings are not classical Egyptian, we must finally accept, because our gradually increasing knowledge of Egyptian literature and a number of recent discoveries on the dramatic and ritualistic and mystical writings of the Egyptians, apart from their funereal texts, all these prove conclusively that the Thoth of ancient Egypt is not actually the Thoth Hermes of the Hermetic philosophy. We must come down to a more recent time in order to find the inspiration behind Hermeticism as we know it. There is every reason to assume from the text and the study that the works could not have been written earlier than the time of the rise of the golden age of Greek philosophy. Therefore, that the writings could not, in their surviving structure, be earlier than the 3rd or 4th century BC. Also, there are other elements involved. Elements coming from the eastern side, indicating strong Oriental influence. And this Oriental influence is of a type which could not be any earlier than the golden period of Grecian thought, the so-called Age of Pericles. Therefore, assuming this to be the earliest possible date, and remembering always that the earliest known versions of these works are in Greek, we must also determine, if possible, the latest conceivable date. And knowing the quotations from the Hermetic writings made by the Fathers in the 1st and 2nd century, we can say with reasonable certainty that this work, the Corpus Hermeticum, must have been compiled or brought together in a period of approximately 300 years, not earlier than the middle of the 4th century BC, or later than the beginning of the Christian era. This general pattern will be subject to perhaps a re-estimation of 40 or 50 years, but I think not more than that. Actually, the Corpus Hermeticum consists of 42 books. At least it is so traditionally stated. Against this is the rather bizarre background in which it is affirmed that the writings of Hermes originally included 10,000 volumes. This, I think, again, must cause us to pause and assume that probably a symbolic meaning is intended. Here we have something to suggest Hermes as universal mind, the writer of all books. Even on this point, however, we must have a cautious attitude. because we know, in listing the books of Plotinus, who came in a little later in North Africa, that the term book was not used then just as we use it today. It was used with a bit of the Soroyan quality, which was not so well known to antiquity, because some of the books of Plotinus do not contain over 1,000 words. They're comparatively short tracts, but they are still called books. Thus, we are not sure how much actual writing might be involved in the so-called mythological library of the size mentioned. The next point is that the number 42, to refer to the so-called authentic works, is a highly significant number. It is the number of the Egyptian assessors of the dead, the jury that try the soul in the field of Amentet. It is also the number of the provinces of Egypt. There were 42 nomes, or provinces, and that is why there were 42 assessors, one of the jurors being selected from each of the provinces or nomes and their celestial correspondences in the universe. Thus, the number 42 suggests high symbolism of some kind, and also reminds us that the phrenologists of the 19th century, for some reason quite unknown, decided that there were 42 faculties of the human brain. Again, a number appearing which seems to exhaust certain intellectual processes and reflexes within the human intellectual equipment. So we have to be a little cautious on this point, sensing the possibility that we are dealing with an allegory or a figurative concept of some kind, possibly even Kabbalistic. The next point in connection with it, of course, is that up to the present time, very few of the so-called original works of Hermes have been known. We will in a later discussion go into these books, but for our orientation problem, we might say that up to now 42 works are not known. The principal work that is known today is the Pyamandres, or the Shepherd of Men. Outside of that, there are other short fragments, but the Corpus Hermeticum contains nothing resembling 42 books. Early writers came to the conclusion that it never did. But now we must also pause for a moment and mention the Kennebuskian find at Luxor in Egypt in 1946, when the discovery of a Gnostic library about 30 miles from Luxor also included within this collection of books several Hermetic writings not previously known to exist. This opens the door for the speculation that it is possible that 42 works did exist at one time, that there was a reason for this selection, that it was not entirely arbitrary, or if it was arbitrary, it was a division set up within a group of writing in order to indicate some important sequence or symbolism involved in the work itself. Today, the term Hermetic is perhaps more loosely used than any other in the field of philosophy. We may say that after about the 2nd or 3rd century A.D., this term became gradually the synonym of secret. Anything that was completely sealed, completely hidden, completely locked, was regarded as hermetically contained in some way, and we still use the term to signify a sealed vessel or retort. Actually, as time went on, the term was used in connection with practically every system of unorthodox thinking that developed in the Mediterranean and European theaters from the 3rd century to the 17th. Now that is a long period of time. The word was thrown around and variously applied and misapplied for nearly 1,400 years. During this time, it certainly wandered far afield. A very large literature involving it arose upon alchemical speculation. It even became involved in medicine and in astronomy and in mathematical formulas of one kind or another. It came in general to represent practically the whole body of a secret or profound learning, particularly such learning as related to causes or to principles not immediately otherwise obvious or available. From this we must come to the conclusion that today it is exceedingly difficult to differentiate between the layers and overlayers of speculation which have developed around this theme. If we study the period most involved in the rise of Hermetic philosophy, say the period from the 3rd century BC down through and into the 1st century AD, this period certainly stands out as a period of extraordinary mental activity. It also stands out as the beginning of the rise of sectarianism as it had never previously been known. And we must pause for a moment to analyze this because I think it is important to us. Our ancient forebears in the North Africa Mediterranean theater usually had their own local religions. They had the religions of their provinces and of their cities and communities. Usually the city or community faith was based upon that of the larger geographical area involved. When a nation conquered another nation, it conquered the gods along with mortals and brought its own religion which superseded that of the people that had been conquered. Thus there was very little actual change of faith due to sectarianism. People were not inclined to say, I prefer to worship this way, and you can worship that way if it pleases you. You worshipped according to the land in which you lived. And if anything happened and your land changed proprietors, then it was assumed that if your gods were not strong enough to preserve the country that they governed, then it was a good idea to change your gods and join up with the conquerors, and at least be on the right side of the situation. And as changes in the religions of peoples were very slow, and most reformations were of slight general importance, I think we can say that up to the beginning of this critical period, there was almost no concept of what the Shakespearean plays refer to as a misbeliever, an individual with a wrong religion. The only way you had a wrong religion was to be in the wrong place, or to fail to change when some other religion took over your country. There were not minority faiths and majority faiths, such as we know today, nor were there the 500 jarring sects referred to by Omar. These things simply had no existence. There was practically no tendency of anyone to say to another man, your faith is wrong, or your gods are unreal, or anything of that nature. That attitude was foreign to antiquity. Wherever the deities were strong enough to protect you, you worshipped them. And generally, the so-called state religion concept prevailed. And if you were within the state, you held to its faith. If you traveled from another country, temporarily as a merchant or someone of that nature, and you came within the area of a deity different from your own, it was assumed that there would be a certain fraternization among the gods also. Your belief was held with respect, but it was very unlikely that you would be able to convert anyone to it in the new area. You were there as a guest. Your God was there as a guest of the local deities. And everybody expected everybody to take a nice attitude about the whole thing. All of a sudden this changed. And changed in an extraordinary way. There gradually developed, in an incredibly short time, considering the motions of these days, a difference of attitude involving the total rejection of certain ideas as false and superstitious, the imposing of an entirely new group of ideas, and the division of peoples into schismatic groups, bitterly antagonistic to each other, and frequently ready to persecute and martyr the members of other faiths. This was a new and different situation. It arose with the changing of certain patterns, and we still are not too sure of what caused these patterns to change. But individuals living quietly within the atmosphere of their local gods did not change without cause. And this cause was not revelational. This cause was historical, social, and political. It had to be, because it had to strike into the lives of many persons of different minds and in different localities, in whose lives and thoughts such ideas had not previously existed to a degree that there is any historical record of them. Something happened, and we must begin to try to find out what did happen. One of the things that probably contributed very strongly to this situation was the rise of the Roman Empire. The Romans were the first great colonizing people of our knowledge. Also, they were the outstanding exponents of a way of life based upon commerce, exchange, and economic procedures. The Roman actually carried his religious philosophy more lightly than any other recorded ancient people. To him, religion was secondary to business. Of course, it's quite incredible that such should be the case, and we can hardly imagine it, although we're in exactly the same spot today. The Roman had his religious services, and he had his prayers, but he was perhaps the first man to pray for the inconvenience of his competitors. He very definitely invited the gods to work a hardship on anyone he didn't like. He also was perhaps among the first to pray for profit and for these material concerns which were comparatively secondary in the religious life of ancient peoples. He was also confronted with a situation that perhaps disillusioned him, or on another way of looking at it, opened him to the modern attitude on religion. In the process of colonizing and conquering and extending the boundaries of his domain until the Roman, in his glory, controlled most of the known world. In this procedure, it was necessary for him to absorb, govern, direct, and integrate into the great pattern of the Roman political structure more than 100 different peoples. These peoples, each with their own religions. This was the first time that these various religions had been subjected to the domination of a comparatively unreligious people. Here we have an interesting situation, because we can no longer assume that the gods of Rome simply won the battle. The Romans took much more faith in their phalanx and in their trained military power and in their machines of war than they did in divine intercession. The peoples conquered did not find it, therefore, possible to simply worship the gods of Rome. Even the Romans could not tell them how to do so. Other than state festivals and certain broad concepts, the Romans had no religious substitute for the type of spiritual value which existed among the peoples that were conquered. At no time, for example, did the Roman have a religious philosophy as deep as that of the British Druids, although he conquered Britain. He never had a religion or philosophy as great, noble, or profound as the philosophies and religions of Greece. Yet he became temporal master of Greece. Step by step, therefore, the world was bound together without benefit of the gods. Now the Roman was enough of a businessman to realize something that even we do not fully recognize as we try to gather around some such place of compromise and arbitration as the United Nations Council chamber. The Roman realized that he could not profitably destroy the religions of all the peoples he conquered. He realized that to do so would be to destroy the social structure of the world. He therefore controlled the religion, but did not attempt to destroy it. And in the height of the empire, Rome, in its great edicts, declared universal religious tolerance. And at the time of the great Roman Forum, which was really the common ground of the empire, temples to many deities of many races and of many nations stood side by side with complete immunity from persecution. The Roman did not care what you worshipped, as long as you paid your taxes and kept out of treasonable activity. He did not care what your religion was, as long as you did not attempt to discredit the economic, political, military, or social power of the Roman state. Therefore, nearly all religious persecution in Rome was the result of groups or individuals attacking the Roman way of life. As long as they did not do this and simply maintained their interest in their own affairs, the Romans were not inclined to persecute in any way. And the proof of that is that nearly all of the great religious and philosophical teachers of the period at one time or other drifted into Rome, had schools there, and taught publicly without any interference of any kind. They taught many doctrines strange to Rome, but they paid their taxes and kept out of politics, and all went well. This, however, presented for the first time a situation that had never existed in our general thinking. The world, the Roman world, had the spectacle of many gods meeting on a common ground, the temples of many faiths, and to a certain degree, this proximity must have influenced Roman thinking. It must have caused the Roman, and later the members of other peoples that came to Rome for one reason or another, to do for the first time what you might call religious shopping. They began to look around. Instead of simply worshiping the conventional deities of Rome, they learned that a certain teacher was particularly outstanding, so they went to him. We know that because of their attitude, the Roman intellectual would go to the great teacher of rhetoric regardless of his gods. That made no difference. But we can be quite certain that an outstanding master of rhetoric or philosophy addicted to other deities would certainly involve his students in his personal philosophies and religions as time went on. So we have the possibility, which did not previously exist, of the average person weighing gods against each other, trying to observe the relative values of things, and coming to the conclusion that this was deeper than that, or that was more shallow than this, and the possibility arose of the individual saying, I believe this philosophy or this theology is better than that. Previously, such comparison was comparatively impossible. This arose also in the building of Roman philosophy. And when we study the works of the principal Roman philosophers, as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the Emperor Julianus, and Cicero, and several of the other outstanding men of the time, we know that they were all eclectic philosophers. That is, they showed definitely that each one of them had trotted from one temple to another and had gained something every time he stopped. And out of this religious circumambulation of the forum, he had come to a new kind of philosophy, with a bit of Egyptian, a bit of Greek, a bit of Persian, and perhaps a few vestiges of old Roman lore, and a kindly thought for the Druids, or the Mithraic teachings which became the principal religion of the Roman legions. During their period of the conquest of Britain, for example, the Roman soldiers were not even worshipping the Roman gods. They were worshipping the Persian Mithraic deities. The image of Mithras slaying the ox was the principal symbol, and the Roman soldiers left it in England by a little stream, and because of this statue it was later called Oxford, and there the great University of Oxford was built, being built upon a monument, or in relation to a monument of a Persian god placed there by Orthodox Roman legionnaires. Now you begin to see that we're in what might be termed a polyglot situation. Rome made possible, in fact made inevitable, that discriminating persons who previously probably had never visited far from their own lands were now able, within Rome itself, or in Alexandria under Roman control, or in Athens under Roman control, or in Antioch under Roman control, or Ephesus, all of these great polyglot centers being then Romanized politically, that they could go to these centers, or living in them could enjoy extraordinary educational and cultural opportunities. That in any one of these cities a dozen great teachers might be flourishing together, not as in Greece, divided by their arts and sciences primarily, but now divided in the total religion, philosophy, and idealism which dominated their systems. There is no doubt that without such a situation, Gnosticism, a polyglot belief, could not have come into existence. Neoplatonism could not have arisen to the condition of general recognition which it enjoyed. There would have been very little possibility of the ascent of Manichaeanism, which was another one of these polyglot beliefs, nor would we probably have had Hermetic philosophy. They all seem to be more or less involved in this pattern. We also find rising in areas under general broad Roman influence, such as Judea, the rise of the Essenian cult, later the Kabbalists, and in North Africa the Jewish sect of the Therapeutae. We find men like Philo-Judaeus arising in this pattern for the first time, writing a work on religion in terms of comparative religion, in which, instead of deriving his total message from his own faith, he immediately began to use other faiths as means of explaining his own. This situation may be said to have broadly existed just at the critical period that most interests us. Nor can we overlook the fact that Christianity rose at precisely the same time, and that Christianity, as a structural faith, bore witness within itself again of a highly complicated intellectual, moral, aesthetic background, a background in which from the very beginning Christianity stood out against, for instance, the background of Orthodox Judaism. Here we have a faith emerging by a strenuous reform. Here we find this faith spreading almost like wildfire, extending through a highly conditioned society. Had Egypt, with its old gods, had its old impregnable position, had the ancient deities of Greece been firmly and completely dominant, and had the Latinized Greek gods of Rome had the strength and domination and complete authority that they had in the times of Numa, or even in the period of the first Caesars, we could not have imagined any polyglot or heterodox faith spreading through these areas without an immediate reaction that would have almost exterminated it. Instead of that, we find it reaching people who are already inquiring who are already a little uncertain, who are already disillusioned in something. The great note of Judaism of the time was disillusionment. The ancient gods of Israel had not preserved their people from the tyranny of Rome or the tyranny of Herod. The old vows had been broken. The punishment of deity was upon a delinquent people. All these explanations, man's moral effort to avoid or evade the inevitable fact that as a sovereignty he had been defeated and enslaved. All this turmoil, all this increasing doubt, the power of Rome took away from nearly all these other peoples the absolute faith which they previously had in their own deities, and gave them no immediate transference of that faith to any other group of deities. And gradually out of this confusion appears to have arisen a kind of intellectual individuality, perhaps best represented by your eclectic philosophy. These people simply, as we said, went shopping intellectually. And they bought a little from this store and a little from that mart or shop. And they built together a philosophy based upon experience, justified by personal favor, and perhaps containing a beautiful assortment of partly digested inconsistencies, as in the very beautiful but not maturely organized meditations of Marcus Aurelius. This perhaps is the answer, by a rather long roundabout road, but one that almost has to be covered, to the rise of the corpus hermeticum. It represents a natural instinct on the part of man, an instinct that we are feeling today, the instinct for the need for a substantial religious philosophy of life, an instinct that is pressed on by disillusionments, an instinct which is somewhat embittered, an instinct which has no longer the open-minded faith of the small child, but rather the disillusioned attitude of maturity. No longer this willingness, this readiness to believe all good things, but a certain suspicion, a fear that all pretenses conceal ulterior motives, or perhaps the continual fear of being hurt again, a further disillusionment involved in spiritual conviction. We know from the writings of Boethius and others that this disillusionment was strong in these early formative years of our modern religious life. If this can be regarded as valid, and we assume, as we must, that all old faiths did not die in their tracks. In other words, in these critical periods, a curtain didn't fall over the religions of the world, and all the old ways simply ceased by magic. It was reported that great Pan died, but we have no proof that this actually happened. We only know that he was no longer to be seen playing on his pipes by the side of the river. Actually, Egyptian philosophy did not die. Greek philosophy did not die. The Druids did not die. They were perpetuated in England in the bards. They were perpetuated in all the later mythology and lore, such as the Arthurian cycle and the legend of Taliesin. All the old ways lived on, but they lived on with certain modifications and changes. And in many instances, they flowed together to form new combinations which lived, and the original patterns were no longer entirely distinguishable. We know, for example, that before the end of the 6th century, Egyptian philosophy in Egypt was virtually dead. By that time, Moslemism was beginning to come in, and in a short time the land of the pharaohs would no longer be Egypt. It would be an Arabic state in which perhaps only a few of the old Copt Christians held any real link to the past. Therefore, if Egyptian religion survived at all in Egypt, it survived in Coptic Christianity. And we have reasons to know that this is quite essentially true, for there is much evidence of the survival of Egyptian religion in the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and the Armenian Orthodox churches. So things disappeared into patterns and came out again much later. And because after this decline of the Roman Empire came the Dark Ages, with almost complete illiteracy, a great deal that was carried across this long dark interval was born with half memory. People did not even know anymore where it came from. They had forgotten, and did forget, in the course of 400 or 500 years, the entire cycle of descent. Little by little, the symbolism was moved into new patterns and imposed upon new doctrines until the original situation was comparatively forgotten. And today, if you go through a great cathedral or study the various parts and elements of Christian ritualism, you will find hundreds of relics, fragments, survivals of much older pre-Christian beliefs. But the average Christian believer does not even know this. Therefore, it is quite likely that he did not know it 1,000 years ago, even as well as he does not know it today. I finally made a sentence out of that, didn't I? Anyway, out of the polyglot of Greek, Egyptian, some Syrian, possibly some Hindu, and other Asiatic faiths, we seem to find 2 or 3 important groups emerge. One of these groups was most certainly the Hermetic. It is also interesting to observe that the early church fathers, the ante-Nicene fathers, ante now meaning before, not against, before the Council of Nicaea, the ante-Nicene fathers accepted out of the past 2 so-called pagan teachers with almost universal respect. A little later they added a third. The first 2 that they accepted were Plato and Hermes. And the third, who became popular a little later but retained his popularity beyond either of the others, was Aristotle. And by the rise of medieval Christianity, Aristotle was held in just about as high a regard as any of the prophets or patriarchs. Christianity became Aristotelian, whereas in the early part of it, it was essentially Platonic. But that these church fathers in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries should not have resented either Plato or Hermes is itself an interesting point. It means that they recognized in these systems certain truths or certain realities which could not be denied, or which were so stated that they could be Christianized to the benefit of the new faith. What then was the basic point upon which so much of this depended? And apparently, this basic point in both cases was the definition of deity. The Gnostics had an entirely different definition of deity, so they were almost completely rejected. The Neoplatonists, with their peculiar mystical approach, also found little favor. But the Platonists and the Hermetists found a very strong favor because of their approach to deity as a purely monotheistic being. Therefore, we must say that Hermetic philosophy introduces strongly, sometime slightly before or at about the period of the Christian era, a totally monotheistic concept of God. Now this is interesting because it has been called a pantheistic monotheism. Not a polytheistic, but a pantheistic. In other words, the one deity of Hermes and of Plato was a deity within creation, not a deity outside of or brooding over creation. The attitude of Hermes is the same as the attitude of St. Paul, the God in whom or in which, and we are told that probably the original of the New Testament statement was also in which we live and move and have our being. Thus the deity of Hermes was an all-enclosing spiritual principle, and this essentially is also the Logos of Plato. Thus the belief in one God seems to have endeared these two schools to the early rising Christianity, and to have caused the Christian church, particularly in the period of its great apologists, we should be in a position to support our position and to prove that we disagree with knowledge rather than without knowledge. And I can't imagine a more delightful example of this situation than that which relates to the Hermetic literature. For in this we have a wonderful disagreement. We have the most learned persons over a period of perhaps 1,800 years in violent disagreement. Each of these positions has been taken with skill. Most of the authorities have done everything in their power to ferret out the facts. When we say everything in their power, we place certain provisions. For it is not in the power of any person to go completely against conviction. And most of the erroneous opinions that we have in life arise from prejudice, from some bias or limitation by which it is impossible for us to think clearly and freely and to examine all facts upon their own merit alone. We are conditioned by our living, by our thinking, by our education and our environment. And these conditioning factors move in upon our thinking and frequently distort it. Therefore, if a person researching in some field belongs to a school that has strong prejudices, he has already lost his own freedom of thinking, his own individual directive. We'll begin with a discussion to be found in the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria. This writer was alive and at work as a literary man between about 175 and 220 A.D. He belongs to the great group of ante-Nicene fathers, writing, of course, strongly from an early Christian prejudice. Yet he was living with the peoples of Egypt. He knew them, and in many instances, in most cases, there was a strong streak of honesty in the things that he stated, although there could be much bias in his interpretation of facts. He was reasonably correct on his basic facts. He describes a procession in Egypt, which apparently he had seen, a sacred ritualistic processional involving the custodians and bearers of the Books of Hermes. He describes how a procession of priests and savants, teachers, moved in very sacred ritualistic order, each with an appropriate symbol and wearing certain insignia indicating the department of learning over which he presided. Clement also says that to earn these distinctions of learning, it was necessary for these scribes, scholars, and priests to have memorized certain books of Hermes, some 3 books, some 4 books, some 10 books. These various religious and philosophical teachers also carried emblems relating to the branches of learning over which they presided. Therefore, some of them had become masters of the medical books of Hermes, others of those books dealing with statesmanship and law and the government of peoples, others still of astronomy, mathematics, navigation, and the secrets of the heavens and the geography of the earth, still others in turn of philosophy, of the deeper mysteries of the mind, of those sciences which are speculative, inductive, or theoretic, and still others bearing those books and insignias which indicated that they were students of the divine mysteries concerning the nature of God, of deity, of the state religion, of the secondary deities and tutelaries, and all things which had to do with theology. Adding together the books specifically referred to by number but not by name by Clement, we find clear statement of 42 books, divided apparently into a wide variety of subjects, in short and simple, covering practically every field of knowledge known in the ancient world. Now we have here several facts of importance. The first is that Clement writes apparently as an eyewitness to these rituals, taking them for granted, and his contemporaries must have known whether he was correct or not, and it is unlikely that he would have perpetrated a fraud. It would have been too easy to detect it, and some other writers would certainly have come out violently against him. The second important point is dating, namely that this procession occurred probably not later than 220 AD, and possibly as early as 150 AD. This gives us a kind of orientation which brings us violently into conflict with one of the greatest antiquarians of his time, Fabricius. He declares it to be his most solemn and sincere conviction that the Hermetic books could not have been written prior to the year AD 300. Now here we come head-on into one of our least minor problems. Is it conceivable that Fabricius was not aware of the statement by Clement? This is almost impossible. Had he not noted it himself, someone else would have brought it to his attention. He was working at a time when literature was not as abundant as it is now. Men did not overlook source books centuries ago, when these constituted practically the sum total of authority. Therefore, we try to understand why Fabricius took his position. The answer is obvious from other authorities working in the field. According to this answer, Fabricius assumes that the books carried by the Egyptians in their religious processional could not have been the present books that we now associate with Hermes. Fabricius would be inclined to follow the school with which he had greatest fondness and take it for granted that the books referred to must have been primarily Egyptian, that these books must have been in the Egyptian philosophy, in the Egyptian religion, and almost certainly in the Egyptian glyphic writings. He, on the other hand, Fabricius, takes the position that the Hermetic books that we know today were undoubtedly written in Greek. Now, where we do not have many facts, positions can be strongly held. His position is sustained by the evidence of his time, but there were two things he didn't know. He couldn't know. One was the discovery in 1946 of the Kennebuskian library near Luxor, about 30 miles from Luxor in Egypt. This library proves conclusively that the Hermetic books were in existence prior to AD 300. And the general opinion now is that the manuscripts discovered will probably date from the middle of the 3rd century AD or perhaps the beginning of that century. In other words, these books are practically contemporary with Clement of Alexandria, the man we quoted first. Now, the position that the Hermetic books had to have been written in Egyptian is also assailed by another fact, a fact which perhaps Fabricius did not adequately examine. That is, that considerably earlier, a Greek dynasty of pharaohs had taken over the administration of Egypt. And Egypt was already passing from Egyptian learning to Greek learning. This we evidence from the appearance of the Septuagint version of the Bible, which was actually prepared in Greek in Egypt, probably in the middle of the 4th century B.C. Therefore, to say that Greek could not have originated in Egypt prior to the 4th century A.D. is no longer a tenable hypothesis. Also, we have another interesting point, one that we cannot overlook. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone gave us our first real clue to the Egyptian language. And it is important to us because it is a bilingual inscription in Egyptian glyphs and in Greek. Now, this is important to us for two reasons. First, because this stone was cut or prepared approximately 200 BC. The second point of interest is that this stone actually carries the name of Hermes. It is one of the words, of course, in the Egyptian form, Thoth. But it also carries another very interesting peculiarity by which we divide the Egyptian Thothic literature from the true Hermetic structure. We most of us realize or remember that Hermes is generally referred to in the Hermetic writings as Mercurius or Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest. And in some of the earlier works, this is modified a little, and he is called the twice greatest. But always this peculiar appellation of more than great accompanies the peculiar use of the term in the Hermetic literature. On the Rosetta Stone, the reference to Thoth is Thoth, great, great. In other words, twice great. And this carries with it an implication that is so close to our Hermetic problem that we cannot ignore it. Also, we know, therefore, that 200 BC, a sufficient study had been made and a sufficient interest had been created that a bilingual inscription relating to matters of importance had already assumed the proportion of a necessity. And in Egypt, Greek and Egyptian were both languages needed in the administration of the state 200 years BC. This brings the next point that involves itself in our peculiar situation. How early could these books have been compiled? Here another group of authorities move in. The effort now being to collate or to relate certain words and structure in the writings of Hermes with the existing versions of the Bible. This opens an interesting problem, and it is now generally regarded as likely, from the peculiar use of terms, that the author of the Hermetic works was to some degree acquainted with the Old Testament. The quotations that he appears to use, or the similarities which arise, are clearly to the Septuagint version, or the version that was actually prepared in Egypt. Also, references to the New Testament have been variously traced and implied, and this opens another interesting situation. Namely, that perhaps the author was acquainted with the New Testament, but the evidence to sustain this is less strong than that he was acquainted with the Old Testament. This brings another group of authorities into the picture, namely the recognition that ancient works passing downward over periods of time are frequently changed. A scribe or a translator working with a document and with certain liberty to either polish or refine the style of that document, is very likely to fall into idiom, the idiom of his own time. Our outstanding example of that, of course, is the King James Version of the Bible. This version, prepared and published first in 1611, is a masterful translation into English. Yet any scholar examining the King James Version would date it almost certainly into the opening years of the 17th century. Not because the original contents belong to that period, but because in the translation it has fallen into the idiomatic forms current at the time the translations were made. This can also have occurred in connection with the Hermetic writings. It is not at all impossible that versions or variants of these writings may have appeared at several times, and that these various editions might have been some in Egyptian, some in Greek, and that those in Greek, probably made by scholars, could easily be influenced by dominant books in the field of the literature of that time. So out of this entire rather involved and at the same time interesting detective story, we come to a series of rather negative facts. Actually, no authority has as yet clearly proven his point. It is not absolutely certain that words or peculiar constructions paralleling the Septuagint could not have come into the Hermetic writings at a time of their translation or transliteration from the Egyptian glyphs. Scribes and scholars could have polished the work in the temper of their own days. Nor is it at all impossible that other versions of the work may have been tampered with after the beginning of the Christian era. It is quite conceivable that efforts would be made by certain groups and certain sects to twist or move this group of literature into the Christian camp. On the other hand, certain other groups might have done everything possible to delete Old Testament parallels for various reasons. And later, in the period of the heresies, each translation could be changed, even as we observe changes in the Bibles of the various sects of the early Protestant Reformation. We have therefore only one essential fact that seems to be clear to us, namely that Clement was aware of the existence of some kind of a literature which does not exist in Egyptian glyphs in any manuscripts that we know today. He was aware of this literature as early as 175 A.D. Cicero, flourishing approximately 100 B.C., also refers to the Hermetic writings. Now, shall we say that these were Egyptian works now unknown, or were they the same general body of literature that we are now concerned with? There is nothing to indicate in the remarks of Cicero that he was referring to a particular or special kind of Hermetic writing. He took the attitude of referring to the subject as a corpus or body of literature. From what we are able to gather from these suggestions, and bearing in mind that Clement makes no concept or claim that this ceremony had been recently introduced, or that it differed from ancient and usual practices, we gradually move the date of the Hermetic literature back until, in all probabilities, we have some security as early as the 1st or 2nd century B.C. Beyond this point, we have not so great a security, and we are quite possibly involved in a situation that arose after the gradual decline of the Greek academies and the motion of Greek learning into the Egyptian theater. Now, why do we make a point of the difference between Greek and Egyptian in this case? Is there any reason to assume, for example, that these Hermetic books might not be merely well-polished Greek versions of more ancient Egyptian texts. This is a moot question. In favor of it, of course, is our comparatively inadequate knowledge of Egyptian religion. A knowledge, however, which is gradually filling in. And at last, our Egyptologists are beginning to worry themselves with some texts other than those of the old funereal rites. We're beginning to sense something of the dignity of Egyptian literature, something that we have not known until the last 25 to 30 years. However, against the belief that these works are simply a translation of earlier Egyptian doctrines, there are certain facts not to be overlooked. What we know today of Egyptian religion, what we have been able to piece together, even in more recent years, would lead us to the conviction that the Hermetic books are not orthodox Egyptian texts. They represent some kind of a change. They are not steeped in the Osirian ritual of the later Egyptian religion. They are not part of the great Ammonism that preceded that. They show very little indebtedness to any structure of Egyptian learning which we now possess. There is, however, as Dr. Breasted has pointed out, and Budge of the British Museum supports this position, there is great possibility that mystical or secret sects existed in Egypt at an older time, and that these sects may already have begun the rationalization of their theological concepts, and that religious philosophy, as philosophy, may have arisen in Egypt at an earlier date than we realize, and has generally been ignored because we have not recovered adequate text evidence. If, as was the case in early Christian mysticism, this lack of adequate text is simply due to the fact it was not written, but was passed on as oral tradition, or under obligations, or, as Breasted suggests, the glyphs themselves may be susceptible of two complete systems of interpretation. We may then well be in the presence of a tradition long held orally and finally reduced to written form with the rise of the Greek period of culture in Egypt. This would be consistent because the coming of Greek learning to Egypt would have justified a large part of the Hermetic corpus. In other words, for the first time, the teachings of Hermes may well have become of interest to the average Egyptian, who was beginning to be cultured in the philosophical speculations of the Greeks. Egypt was reticent in these matters because, of course, it claimed, as most ancient nations did, that itself it was the cradle of learning. It might therefore well have refused to wish to accept that a foreign teaching such as Greek was of primary importance, and may have attempted to prove that its own teachers and its own leaders of past times had originated this doctrine. Now let us see how that stands up, because we have an interesting point here. We know that in the 6th century B.C., nearly all Greek scholars visited Egypt. We know that Pythagoras received a large part of his education from the Egyptians. We know that Plato visited Egypt, receiving the mysteries at Sais. We are perfectly well aware that Solon, in the 6th century, went to Egypt, and there he became instructed in the principles of laws, which he later reformed and applied to the needs of the Athenian states. All of these considerations must cause us to realize that Greek philosophy was indebted to Egypt. Yet in Greek philosophy we do not find the elements of the Egyptian religion which flourished at the time of Pythagoras or Plato. We do not find Pythagoras returning with a hierarchy of Egyptian deities to impose upon the Greek mind. We do not find him returning with Egyptian religious rites, ceremonies, or rituals although Pythagoras was profoundly concerned with ritualism. From what we can generally observe, the Pythagorean system was essentially derived from the Orphic, which in turn probably came originally from the Far East. Yet here we have Greeks going to Egypt, learning many things and returning to strengthen and unfold their own Grecian system of philosophy. Is it possible, then, that the return of Greek philosophy to Egypt, about the time of the rise of the Hermetic literature, was more than a coincidence? Is it at all conceivable that Pythagoras and Plato and Solon and others who made the same, at that time, difficult journey, actually received a teaching different from that of Orthodox Egyptian religion, and that in the mysteries of this teaching they derived the principles of their own Greek system? If this is true, then there is no reason to doubt that the Hermetic tradition in Egypt, which in many ways is similar to the Greek, might well have been older than the Greek, and might have been communicated to those Greeks who later fashioned the Platonic and Peripatetic systems of philosophy, or even the Stoical and Cynical schools. All this gives us something else to worry about, which I think I add as a kind of a novelty, because as far as I can find out, the others have not been worrying about this point. This is a private worry of our own. There is every reason, then, to assume that being without knowledge of the actual facts involved, and having only circumstantial evidence upon which to build, we cannot preclude the possibility that the Egyptians did possess the rudiments of Hermetic philosophy earlier than the rise of Greek philosophy. This would seem to be more probable, inasmuch as the Greeks borrowed from the Egyptians at a time when the Egyptians were not borrowing from the Greeks. In those days, when Solon visited Egypt, the Egyptian priests referred to the Greeks as children, infants in learning, and Solon was inclined to agree with them and recognize the tremendous value of being allowed to become acquainted with the Egyptian system of law and political structure. All these situations lead together to refute the belief that is advanced by one authority as a pat solution to everything, namely that the Hermetic works were compiled by an individual who was interested in both Egyptian and Greek lore, and therefore, in all probability, was a moderate scholar in these different fields, perhaps living late enough to also indulge in Christian speculation. These points seem unreasonable, and I think that we have to recognize the probability that the so-called Hermetic tradition could have existed in Egypt without being directly involved in the state religion. It could have been a philosophical school. It could have been a group of sectaries of its own peculiar order, like the Essenes in Syria and the Therapeutae also in Egypt, though belonging to an entirely different conviction from the Egyptians. This gives us one other situation that we cannot afford to overlook, however, even though it becomes a little contrary to our desire. We must be perfectly fair in presenting the different sides of this situation. It has been a custom since the beginning of the written word for individuals, either for prestige or profit, or to bestow unusual dignity upon some production of their own, to ascribe that production to an ancient writer. We find this all through various works. For instance, as late as the 18th century, a whole group of works were attributed to Aristotle, in which he had no part at all, particularly an essay on midwifery that certainly would never have been Aristotelian. But these tracts, in order to gain a quick public, borrowed ancient names. Friar Bacon, Roger Bacon, was subject to the same type of fabrication. And it is even generally assumed today that books printed as late as 1800 were printed on old paper and old type and backdated to become more impressive. There is no way in which we can estimate what individuals will do to accomplish an end. It has been also the general experience of man that antiquity bestows authority. And wherever a subject wishes to have immediate recognition or to move into a sacrosanct position, it chooses to be appended to an ancient work. Thus, if we say that a work was written 50 years ago, it does not have the same prestige if we say that it was written 2,000 years ago. Antiquity seems to give us a certain sense of confidence. Also, it makes a remoteness, dividing the work from our common habits and dividing the author from the persons we may have known. We know what fabrications in various fields of literature have accomplished in this particular case or instance. Thus, it is always possible that the Hermetic writings were produced at some period, perhaps between the 3rd century BC and the 1st or 2nd century AD, and attributed to an earlier author. This attribution may not be as completely dishonest also as one might think, because even today we have a class of literature, particularly in metaphysical and mystical matters, in which various ancient persons are said to have revealed themselves, or to have dictated writings, or to have projected thoughts upon later writers. We have a considerable field of spiritualistic literature sustaining this position. We also have a number of minor religious movements of comparatively recent order or vintage, in which the essential teachings are attributed to miraculous circumstances and remote ages. If these things come through a kind of inspiration, if an individual entranced or under the pressure of vision seems to see, note, or be in contact with a remote scholar or a great teacher of the past, he may very well actually believe that some document dictated to him is actually attributable to the original author. This type of thinking we do find, and we find it quite honestly advanced. And with perhaps 18 or 1900 years of obscurity in between, it is very difficult for us to clearly demark these possibilities and to give them adequate consideration. I think one point is of very great interest to us, and that is that the history of Hermetic literature is loaded with a variety of unreasonable circumstances. Even after we pass out of the original Alexandrian center, for in some way this whole literature seems to have risen in this great North African melting pot of beliefs and doctrines, it moved into the Near East to involve or invite the speculations of the Arabs. They did a splendid job of speculating, by the way. Their extravagances added to the original uncertainty have not done anything to clarify the matter. But they did undoubtedly prepare commentaries and tracts, and in their own inimitable style had their own revelations relating to the Hermetic philosophy, so that just as we are indebted to them for a number of original Christian documents, so we can definitely say that we are indebted to them for a very remarkable group of Hermetic interpretations, expansions, revisions, and even a book or two that was not previously known to exist. Whether these actually were legitimate or whether they were invented, we have no way of knowing after so long a period of time. This also meant that the Hermetic philosophy returned to Europe. It returned through the Moors and through the Crusades and through the increasing contacts between the Near East and European scholarship. It came back to Europe, or reached Europe, in a blaze of glory. It became one of the great fashions and fads of the time. And Hermes grew in stature to such extent that he eclipsed even Aristotle for a while. And that was a considerable problem in eclipsing. Actually, however, in the interval, in its slow meanderings from Egypt via Arabia and into Spain, and from Spain up through southern Europe into the great centers of European culture in the medieval period, in this period of wandering, the Hermetic philosophy began to change its shape, change its presentation. Much of its so-called broadness was lost. The original Books of Hermes came to be regarded as merely the outer surface of a larger literature, and the entire subject gradually emphasized its scientific import and became practically synonymous with medicine. Thus we have a complete literature dealing with the medical arts, and, of course, one of the prime elements in medicine, chemistry. Chemistry, of course, in those days was without boundaries such as we know now. Chemistry in China, in India, Arabia, was alchemy. And alchemy was a fantastic conglomeration of ancient beliefs and modern experimentation. The alchemists were not, by any means, a group of quacks, nor were they an assembly of madmen. They were devout persons, serious scholars, deep thinkers. And in their thinking and in their speculations, Hermes became their patron saint. And this ancient philosophical personality ultimately dissolved to become the symbolic figure of Mercury, Quicksilver, a chemical element. So in his long journeys, Hermes passed from a demigod of Egypt to a medieval element. Now that was quite a trip. And in the course of this traveling, another interesting thing occurred. During the 15th and early 16th century, a brand new literature accredited to Hermes appeared. For this literature, there is no history whatever. We know beyond reason or doubt that this literature arose from original sources, perhaps not earlier than 1400 AD, and as late as 1500. But the name of Hermes began to appear on the titles, pages, and among the emblemata of alchemy. He became accredited with the preparation of chemical formulas, means of transmuting metals. He was even accredited with the discovery of gunpowder. Now this is so totally different from the corpus hermeticum of ancient times that we must pause. Yet we must also remember the words of Clement of Alexandria in the Stromata, where he tells us that in this procession of priests there were some who carried the symbols of medicine, chemistry, and other arts. Upon perhaps this very slender foundation, Hermes was elevated to become the patron genius of medieval Hermeticism. This Hermeticism divided very definitely into two schools. One was that of the gold makers, whose philosophy was not, however, as superficial as we might think. They were convinced that there were analogies in nature, and that any law or pattern or process by which the regeneration of man could be achieved could also be used for the actual transmutation of base metals. On the hypothesis that all processes in nature have a certain uniformity and consistency, it was assumed that if man could save his own soul, thus transforming himself from a material to a spiritual creature, that he could also transform metals from the dross side of themselves to a more purified state, suitable for medicines and elixirs, suitable for the extension of life and perhaps the achievement of physical immortality. These gold makers, however, such as those who were so industriously occupied in the old street of the alchemists in Prague, Czechoslovakia, these alchemists were ridiculed by another group. This other group maintained that the entire Hermetic tradition, as it has now been called, dealt not with metals, but with the regeneration of the intangibles in human nature. If anything, they would have taken the position that if you can transmute metals, this proves you can transmute man. They would have reversed the polarity. They would have reversed the interest, affirming that the mere achievement of material wealth was an ignoble and unreasonable end, totally inconsistent with the divine destiny of man. These mystical gold makers then immediately began to reduce the chemical symbols and tracts and writings attributed to Hermes and other authors into metaphysical textbooks, books inclined to reveal that transmutation was a kind of yoga, a kind of mystical regeneration within the human being, the man himself being the alchemical retort in which these marvelous changes might take place. And these same mystics assumed that Hermes, representing Mercury, Quicksilver, representing this mysterious agent in which all elements can be reconciled, that Mercury therefore represents the reconciling power of human consciousness, or perhaps more exactly, of the human mind. For Mercury becomes the key, the master of the mystery, by means of which all things are unlocked. And the medieval man liked to think of reason as this power by means of which all mysteries could be solved, all good things could be accomplished, and the interval between man as a physical being and man as a spiritual being could be crossed or bridged through reason and illumination. Now this would carry us back again to the Hermetic books by a circle. For in the Pymander of Hermes, we have no doubt whatever that Hermes is used in this work not only as a person, but as an embodiment or personification of universal mind. So your mystical alchemist seems to have retained the Hermetic tradition, although he passed it through a variety of symbolic processes. Your material alchemist lost it. And perhaps your material alchemist was the mad parent of the entire concept of modern material science, because he certainly was one of the first to conceive of the tremendous personal advantage to himself if he could control laws for profit. If, however, he was a mystic, he would control or direct laws only for the glory of truth. And this division on various levels has endured to our present time. With the rise of modern chemistry, the Hermetic tradition has more or less faded from our consideration. But this does not mean that interest in these old processes has entirely ceased. At the present time, as a fair authority on books and on rare books, I think I can say that there is still a tremendous demand, a tremendous learned reading public, desirous of securing any material relating to the Hermetic experiments of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. Any rare work which appears in this field is immediately purchased, disappearing again from the trade. I have talked to book dealers in this country and communicated with them in Europe, and it is rare indeed to find a rare alchemical text, regardless of price, remaining in a dealer's store for more than a few days. In other words, there's a market somewhere. The interest in these things continues, and there are people who are ready to pay $200, $300, $500 for one of these old books. The market is always greater than the supply. Reprints of these works are periodically made and become in their own condition rare books. And it is common knowledge that very few even reprints of the rarer Hermetic writings are available. They disappear almost instantly, not into public institutions, but into private libraries, where they are variously used. Thus we have another interesting point. 90% of these books are not going into the libraries of chemists, nor are they going into the collections of alchemists who have any intention of making physical experiments with the texts. They are going mostly into the collections of philosophically minded persons who are concerned with the attempt to restore the lost symbolism of the Hermetic tradition. And in that respect, we might mention the work on Hermetic philosophy by Mrs. Sarah Atwood, one of the outstanding rarities of the last century. A very deep and serious study of the Metaphysics of Hermes, the metaphysics of the great alchemical tradition, represented in Europe by several thousand valuable books, a tradition that rose mysteriously and with tremendous, spectacular intensity around 1550, and was completely forgotten, or at least had passed from all interest as far as the public is concerned, as early as 1700. In that 150 years or less, the entire restoration of alchemical Hermeticism had its course. And by the beginning of the 19th century, 1800 or even earlier, these books were rare and almost impossible to obtain. Now this gives us some general clue to a difficult problem. We have one or two other points that we want to make as clear as possible. As we have only numbers, such as the number 42 given to us by Clement, or perhaps the allegorical numbers of earlier writers who attributed to Hermes anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 volumes or more. These numbers are not represented by any available literature. The Hermetic fragments that we have today, and which are clearly separate from the other groups which we mentioned, the Neoplatonists, the Gnostics, and the early Christian church, these fragments are comparatively meager. Yet reference is made to numerous others. What happened to them? Is it true that at some time along the way these were drawn into secret societies, and that the alchemists at one time at least did possess access to these manuscripts or books? Is this possible? It is possible, but belongs in the sphere of romantic thinking. We have no serious evidence. Actually, only a few texts, the Pymander particularly, and the Asclepius, remain, which are completely and unitedly bound up with this tradition. These are surrounded by a vast array of borderline literature that seems to tip in almost any conceivable direction. There is even some evidence of alchemical writings in the Alexandrian period in Egypt, but this had not achieved the interest which we know today. We are aware, however, that the Egyptians experimented under the name of Hermetic art with the creation of synthetic gems. We know that they were able to copy, in what was later called Roman paste, most of the precious stones of antiquity. And because the art of the lapidary was at that time not very well known, it is quite possible that that fraud occurred, in which synthetic stones were passed off as genuine. That these creations of artificial stones, the development of certain dyes for textiles, for various purposes, the creation of malleable glass, or glass of itself that would bend, these ancient arts, like that of Greek fire, are known to have had some real existence. They were included in Hermetic thinking at that time, therefore indicating that the Hermetic system was regarded as scientific and having secrets useful on the level of practice and trade. This, again, is represented only by a meager circle of authority or traditional remain. How then shall we examine the books of Hermes out of the knowledge that we have of them? I think the answer lies in one direction only, namely that the Hermetic concept in itself must have had a school of some kind surrounding it. That these books appeared and remained simply isolated fragments of literature is inconceivable in the mind of the time. For in those days it would have been very difficult for any scribe to have remained concealed. It was not then possible to follow publishing procedure. These manuscripts had to have been circulated among at least a small group of friends, devotees, or dedicated persons who were at least partly aware of the facts. Thus this literature could not have simply appeared and not have had any foundation in realities. In our discussion of the Pymander, which will come later, and which perhaps should have been introduced at this point in the planning of the series, but it wasn't, so we must follow the pattern, we have some interesting thoughts. In the Pymander, we have a general concept of universal procedure, a concept partly paralleling that of the Greeks, perhaps somewhat paralleling that which was later to become Gnosticism, and to a little degree, at least, paralleling the early theological speculations about universals held by the Christian fathers. Very early, the church drew to it a certain number of scholars, and these began to speculate outside of the jot and tittle of the approved canon. And the mind of man, once it has reached a certain size, cannot be further pressed back into an old pattern, so the church had to be prepared for men thinking forward rather than merely backward. This change in perspective in the various fields of learning is important to us because about the time that we attribute to the creation and circulation of the Hermetic writings, we find the basic Hermetic concepts beginning to influence thought outside of the school itself. We are told that Hermes, for example, wrote upon astronomy. And we can only pause to realize that Ptolemy of Alexandria, who was perhaps the greatest astronomer and geographer of the ancient world, and also the father of most modern astrological speculation, that Ptolemy's works move from the same premise of that of the Hermetic revelation. In other words, Hermes' universe is rather closely associated with the later developments of Ptolemy. The concepts of geography and navigation are those of the Hermetic school and not of the other neighboring schools. The changes which took place in concepts of government and in the healing arts, the secularizing of medicine, and a variety of other subjects which moved and changed the face of the Mediterranean culture. These changes followed closely after the so-called original Hermetic period, and they followed even more closely the original ideas and concepts of the Hermetic school. So we'll then trace some of these ideas in an effort to try to show how they spread out into the literature of the time. We can see, for example, the rise of certain powerful intellectuals in the Roman Empire. It is a mistake for us to assume that the Romans were all ignorant. For from the beginning of the Roman culture to the final decline of Roman life under the coming of the Ostrogoths, the king Theodoric, up to this period, we see the continual structure of a Roman philosophy. And we find this moving through the thoughts and meditations of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, through the great hymns of the Emperor Julian, and finally to Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy. With this, the school closes. Julian, Boethius, and Marcus Aurelius all show Hermetic influence. They show the type of thinking which was peculiarly associated with that school, a kind of thinking which, while similar to Gnosticism, was not Gnosticism. Similar to Neoplatonism, was not Neoplatonism, and with certain Christian elements, was distinctly not Christian. Thus it is quite conceivable that down through this technically difficult period to record, when, as is so often the case, historians were interested only with war and not with culture, that a descent of belief and doctrine can be traced. Now, we also know that one of the introductions which we find in the Hermetic writings is this important approach to the concept of mind. Now, we know that Plato, Pythagoras, and Aristotle seemingly rather well exhausted our concept of the human mind. Yet in the Hermetic writings and in the Hermetic corpus, we find some new aspects of mentalistic thinking. We know, for example, that in most of the Greek schools, mind became an instrument. It was a wonderful and powerful means for the accomplishment of truth. Mind was therefore a kind of channel through which knowledge moved into the individual. But in the Hermetic tradition, we find something that departs from this and gives us a rather different perspective.